Welcome to How to Fix the Internet with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a podcast that explores some of the biggest problems we face online right now. Problems whose source and solution is often buried in the obscure twists of technological development, societal change, and the subtle details of internet law.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Cohn, and I'm the Executive Director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And like a lot of us here, I'm a lawyer.
And I'm Danny O'Brien. I work at EFF too, but I'm not a lawyer.
Then what are you, Danny?
You know, I've spent so long with lawyers, I've kind of forgotten what I am. It's a bit like if you're raised by wolves.
Well, this week we're tackling facial recognition, which will tell us whether you're turned into a wolf, Danny. In the last few years, face recognition has gone from a high-tech party trick to a serious threat to civil liberties. Companies are already touting the ability to turn any photo into a name and identity based on pictures taken from private records and also the public internet. Cities and police forces are being sold equipment that can identify and track citizens as they go about their business in real time, and then permanently record that information for later investigations or, as we've seen, misuse.
I think most people have yet to realize just how good facial recognition has gotten recently. I think it's reached the point where it's a perfectly reasonable thing to expect the software to do, that you can take a photograph of a demonstration or live video, and the facial recognition software will be able to pick out the faces from a crowd, all of the faces, or as many as it can, and then correlate those to a database that could contain everybody who's put their faces up on the internet in a photograph or even a profile picture. That's a reasonable thing to expect modern facial recognition software to do, and that's the pitch that's being given to law enforcement by commercial companies selling this technology, and at a pretty cheap price as well. This is getting to the point of being off-the-shelf software rather than an expensive service that maybe only the NSA can use or large companies can fund.
At the same time that facial recognition is getting really good in some ways, it's also still really bad in some others and quite dangerous. Then the results are often terribly biased. They fail to identify non-white people, people of color, correctly far more often than it fails with white people. It's often embedded in systems and structures and policies that are racist as well. You know, AI and machine learning inferences can only guess about the future based upon the data you fed them about the past. So if the training data is slanted or racist, the guesses about the future will be too. And in addition, there's a growing body of research and a budding set of tools being developed to fool facial recognition. You know, in COVID time, we're seeing even that masks are causing flaws as well. You know, we already have seen the first couple of false arrests based on bad uses of facial recognition, and more on the way. And it's only a matter of time before this spills into political protests.
This is a sort of paradox that we see a lot at EFF in emerging technologies. If the technology really worked as well as it's being hyped, it'd certainly be terrifying for civil liberties, but it's still bad even when it doesn't live up to those promises, because it fails in ways that the authorities refuse to acknowledge or mitigate against.
Yeah, so we're damned if it works and we're damned if it doesn't.
Joining us today is Abi Hassen, co-founder of the Black Movement Law Project, who has been watching just how face recognition can be misused to silence dissent and track legitimate protest. He's been a key figure in the campaign to place limits on the use of this anything but benign technology, where it's increasingly problematic, on the streets during protests. Welcome, Abi.
Thank you so much, Danny and Cindy, for having me.
For our purposes, of course, Abi is a lawyer as well. So how did you get involved in all of this? You know, the Black Movement Law Project is near and dear to our hearts here at EFF because our colleague Nash was also one of the co-founders. But how did you get involved?
So, I started my legal career through several kind of circuitous routes around the law. First as a labor organizer and community activist and community organizer, and kind of mixed role, but heavily involved in labor. And then I kind of ended up transitioning to a more protest focused job where I got hired at the National Lawyers Guild, and coincidentally, right, I got hired there about 6 months before Occupy Wall Street started. So I kind of cut my teeth in the world of protest law and protest activity at a pretty opportune time for seeing some action, so to speak. And then, as that Occupy moment changed and the kind of Trayvon Martin and then Ferguson and then Baltimore started happening, I ended up going down to Baltimore to help with doing some legal support. I met some other folks, and we started Black Movement Law Project out of that kind of recognition that protest legal space needed some kind of explicit Black leadership, and to help try to develop that and help try to work also in places that didn't have existing legal infrastructure, those kind of mid-sized cities where we were seeing a lot of insurrection and protests, but they weren't like the Bay Area or Los Angeles or New York, where there's long established legal support communities. So that's kind of how I got involved. And then the surveillance and protest stuff just naturally came out of working with activists, right? Like working with activists in this post-Snowden moment, and then working with activists like, the dynamics obviously even changed more during the Trump moment, but like it just became clearer and clearer that digital security and the kind of stuff that, digital self-defense became more and more on people's minds.
Can you give us just a thumbnail sketch of what Black Movement Law Project does?
Yeah, I mean, so, it's been kind of transitioning as the moments and the political moments have changed. And so for those first few years in like 2015, 2016 into 2017, it was a lot of on the ground helping really develop jail support and helping people, doing your kind of basic protest training, which is like, know your rights and how to set up your own legal support, how to kind of help guide people through the system, and then that kind of volunteer management and stuff that goes along with that. So our model was really based on helping people locally figure out how to do it themselves and not being in charge of it and not try to run it. But I mean, obviously that went back and forth in lots of different places. And then, like I said before, like as it became clear and clear that there was a need for digital security training, and we saw more and more police kind of just overtly using social media, and there was all the stuff about stingrays started coming out, and this is all again post Snowden, so it's like there was already a level of concern. And so we actually partnered with EFF pretty early on in that time and started a series of digital security trainings across the country. And then I ended up working with EFF also on training tools and stuff like that. So I think that as the moment has changed yet again, and then like we got Trump and then COVID, and I've been doing some remote trainings. I've been working on some research projects. I think that the BMLP as what it was in those early days is not functioning in that way, because we're all kind of doing other things primarily and doing BMLP stuff as a kind of a second job, if you will. And so we're trying to like take the knowledge we have and turn it into like tools, turn it into trainings, turn it into, I'm actually studying now. I'm doing a degree in political theory. So I kind of bring that experience also to kind of more theoretical spaces. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but it's really still kind of developing tools for social change, for political movements out of our experience and kind of collective knowledge.
I think that an organization that can move with the needs of the community is really a healthy one. I want to ask a little more personal question. What fuels you about this? Why are you passionate about this? Where does it come from inside you?
I know that it's not that your question is not just about technology, but like, so just a little background, like I did a degree in computer science, and that was my undergraduate education, kind of in philosophy and computer science. So I've always been interested in these kind of deeper questions of how the world works. And I think that learning about technology and learning about the interaction of technology and society, like it's a helpful way to gain insight into how the world works and how politics works. And so, but I've also always had a strong kind of I don't know if it's like a moral intuition or what, but like, I feel like what is the thing that I can do at this moment that can help what I consider to be the problems in the world, right? And so that's led me on this kind of journey from kind of labor to protest to politics, like just trying to figure out how these things work on one hand and how to best intervene on the other. I think that might have, that was probably the crazy mistake that led me into law school, like the rest of us. But but then it took me a long time to realize that like the law is not what I thought it was, but it is also a venue for creating change, but maybe not in the way I thought it was before going to law school, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a realization a lot of us make in law school. I mean, you're describing a journey that feels very much like mine, I have to say, in terms of just having this inner feeling like your job is to figure out where you can help and where your tools and skills will help the best. And that often does lead you on a kind of I wouldn't say circuitous, but it's a dynamic conversation that you're tending to have with your skills and the world and what the world needs.
And as the non-lawyer, I think, or I feel like a sort of anthropologist here, it's actually amazing that passage between someone studying computer science or being involved in kind of the vague outline and intuitions about technology, and then realizing that that's an important perspective in law too, especially in times of rapid technological change, where the technology changes how civil liberties need to be interpreted in the world.
How would you talk about the risks of face recognition being used by law enforcement during protests or other public political activities?
Like if we play out where the technology is going and think about what capacities that could mean for law enforcement, especially coupled with an increasingly aggressive and I think it's fair to say, anti-democratic attitude in law enforcement generally. I mean, the implications for just plain chilling of speech are tremendous, right? I just talk a little bit personally about my family, and my father came here from Ethiopia, and a lot of my family is from there, and just for example, in the post 9/11 moments, just seeing family members tell their children, no, don't take pictures of anything. We're not allowed to take photos, right? Because we're Muslim, right? Or like when Trump was elected, just seeing just children, like cousins and other relatives, children, teenagers, just terrified, right? They were born in this country, right? They have no reason legally to be scared. So if you think about that's a specific community, maybe that's a specific context, but that has real effects on people's willingness to participate, right? In what is considered a right of an American, which is, to be an active political participant in society, right? And that's a spectrum. Maybe that's on one end of the spectrum, but like at every level, that increased capacity of law enforcement to know exactly where you are and what you're doing at all moments in your life, coupled with a political system and legal institutions that are at times just overtly anti-immigrant, anti-democratic, anti-left. We see, so I think that it's one more element in a pretty scary kind of trajectory for the kind of active public participation that I think we would want to see in a world that is clearly not in a stable and kind of healthy place.
Yeah, I think that's right. It becomes more important for people to be able to have a little zone of privacy around these activities. And so, one of the issues that I think we're struggling with around facial recognition technology and the law is that historically the law and the courts have held that when you're out on the streets, you're in public and you don't have a right to privacy. And, this is something that we're struggling with a little bit. And I wondered how you think about that and how we might need to push the law a bit or kind of address that problem in protecting people against face recognition.
Historically, our Constitution has been amended basically every generation, right? I think the last time was sometime in the 80s, probably. Is that right? But it's been quite a long time since anything like that has happened. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I don't want to just, throw that out there lightly. But, if we think about the invention of the internet and its ramifications on society and think that we've done nothing we've done nothing commensurate legally with the massive social change and economic change, frankly, that creation has wrought. And so I think we need to be thinking big about this, right? Like, I think that the European counterpart, the GDPR, is something that is at least putting a stake in at a slightly higher level. But I think we need to think big because, something you mentioned just a moment ago, the zone of privacy, I think is something that we really should engage with and take seriously, right? Because it's truly like if we think about what the contours of privacy were, even at the time of the Constitution or wherever. I mean, it's different in different arenas, right? Like maybe your neighbor was more likely to spy on you walking out or whatever. But certainly vis-a-vis the state, the zone of privacy has massively shrunk.
I find that take really interesting because you mentioned the GDPR, and I think one of the things that makes the GDPR so powerful comes from almost an accident of history in the European Union, because the European Union in some ways is a young country too, although it's made up of far older nations. And just by an accident of timing, the main constitutional document was crafted in 2007. So it's the Treaty of Lisbon. And just because of that timing, it managed to embed into the fabric of the European Union a relatively new right, which was the right of data protection, which is seen as separate from a privacy right. And so I do think that sometimes there's an importance to creating something that has the feeling of a constitutional level decision, but is about the modern world.
The other thing I think about with regard to this question about how do you get privacy in public is that the specific context we're talking about here is, kind of core First Amendment context, right? The right to free speech, the right to petition government for grievances. And to me, face recognition applied to people when they're out engaging in public protest ought to be protected by the very strong framework of the First Amendment rather than the relatively weak one of the Fourth. We still have a ways to go. The courts haven't bought that argument. I keep trying to tee it up so we can raise it. But I think there are several ways to get at this. And one of them is thinking big about where we want to go in the future. And the other is maybe thinking a little harder about what's already the tools that are already in our Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, I really, I'm right with you on the First Amendment. I think that I don't know the the current status of success, but one of the things that I feel like is on the table is the Assembly, First Amendment Assembly is just very underdeveloped, right? Like, what does assembly actually mean today?
Yeah, I agree. Assembly, association, all of the things that I think we're getting at when we're thinking about why do people come together in the streets to try to demand change. There are actually words in the Constitution that reference that, but we haven't given them the kind of life that I think we could. But I agree.
And one thing that we were talking about earlier, and I think you brought out, is this face recognition doesn't need to work to have a chilling effect on protest. And I think it's often very hard because people know that this invisible technology is around and they're worried about what they can and can't do. And that actually prevents them from protesting unless they're absolutely desperate. When you're doing security trainings and explaining the capabilities of law enforcement, how do you balance that line between explaining what's possible and not, scaring people so much that they don't actually exercise their constitutional rights?
That's always a struggle, and that's a dynamic that just, what I generally do is encourage people to try to think about, one, kind of put all their cards on the table in terms of thinking about their risks and being very aware of them, But I also think that it's also important to understand that institutional prerogatives of law enforcement and try to take that into account, right? Because, like, again, especially after Snowden, everyone was convinced that the NSA was spying on them. And you have to have conversations like, look, the NSA has X number of analysts, right? They're not looking at you. right?
Right.
Or these are who their priorities are, right? Like the people who are getting their laptops taken, like, and that obviously that you is contextual, right? Because maybe they are, right? But that's why it's important to understand your positionality, to understand your positionality and the ideology and priority of law enforcement. But yeah, so that's an important conversation to have. But like the scary thing is the more it becomes turnkey, the more it becomes these kind of AI systems that are just spitting out suspects to law enforcement, the more integrated those systems become, the less actual work law enforcement has to do, which means the more everyone actually is at risk, regardless of the institutional capacities.
Another issue that EFF spends a lot of time talking about are these, who's selling this to government, who's trying to make this as turnkey as possible. And we're seeing increasing public-private partnerships around surveillance generally and face recognition. I just don't think it's very far behind. And, right now I'm thinking specifically of Ring, Amazon Ring, which partners with law enforcement to promote its cameras to homeowners and then suggests that people share their feeds with law enforcement. Or, the case that EFF is litigating now, the Williams case, where a rich guy in San Francisco bought a bunch of cameras and gave them to local business districts and then, said, no, the cops won't have access to this. And then we discovered that during the Black Lives Matter protests earlier this year and even the Pride Parade, the cops did get access in real time to those cameras. And, EFF and the ACLU are sewing over that one. But how do you talk to likely impacted communities about these kinds of things?
These companies are profit-seeking enterprises, and a depression might be it really the dynamic of a loss of advertising revenue. Where are they going to go? Like it seems pretty clear that law enforcement, because we're not cutting a lot of law enforcement budgets, and government contracting, is always a good source of income, right? And so, yeah, I mean, how do we talk about those things? I think you have to have those conversations about the bigger the threat, the bigger the coalition needs to be to counter it, right? And so you can't have, in some sense, it's an opportunity to say, these aren't siloed conversations, right? Like Black Lives Matter is not something that's viewed as anti-police or police trying to counter police violence, can't be separated from basically the political economy of surveillance, right? Like these actually are completely overlapping and intersecting problems that the threat is merging and the response has to be merging also. And it's an opportunity to say, look, I don't have the answer. We can't picket Amazon to any effect right now, but we can support the workers at Amazon who are trying to organize a union, right? And we can support our congressperson who is trying to do a report on monopolistic practices in Silicon Valley, right? We can try to build a kind of political consciousness about anti-monopoly. We can try to create coalitions where people who are focused on the technical threats or the civil liberties threats are learning from and kind of cross-pollinating with people who are working on our other issues to expand our coalitions.
Yeah, and I think you have to spell out these links too, right? And that's one of the big challenges, because I think for a long time, there was this sort of strange and arbitrary division between people worrying about government surveillance and people worrying about corporate surveillance. And of course, the last few years have shown that those are the same problem. And one of the challenges we face, and I think this is true in a lot of spaces, right, is that, first of all, geeks, who are our base, love new technology. So they're the first adopters of things like Ring and surveillance cameras. And also people worried about their safety who don't trust law enforcement or aren't being served by law enforcement also invest in these surveillance programs, right? So we have this thing where we're actually talking to people who should be the most knowledgeable, who should be the people who are most concerned about these alliances. And they're actually being drawn into being complicit with their own neighborhood surveillance. And I have to say, I was sort of worried about this, but was really impressed by how quickly everyone gets it once you paint that. I think we saw that in San Francisco with this sort of public safety surveillance program. And I think the activism around Ring is also kind of going that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, part of why I'm doing, kind of why I've taken this last career trajectory, right, doing a political philosophy or, political theory, is like I found myself teaching technology to activists and teaching politics to technologists and kind of teaching both the lawyers, right? And like that is, I feel like that kind of integration is what we need to do. Like never do a technical demonstration without some kind of hook into the broader political frameworks, right? Use all of those things as opportunities to do more and to expand, right?
I really like that. And what I hear you saying in some ways is that it is kind of all connected, right? Our standing up and helping the folks inside these companies who want to organize and, whether that's bring in a union or otherwise have a bigger voice in what's going on is part of how we help protect protesters from these technologies, because if we empower folks to have a bigger voice in this, and they can begin to have a bigger say in, what are the kinds of tools that are being developed and who are they being sold to. The thing that is especially troubling to me about both Ring and our San Francisco cases is that the technology is actually it's the bleeding edge of the surveillance, right? Our Williams case, the guy just handed out the cameras. That wasn't actually a business proposition. And with Ring, again, the cameras are not that expensive, then they're making it really easy for people to get them. So I'm a little worried that technology is kind of the, cool technology is the foot in the door to a really awful future. And that's not the first time we've seen it, but I really feel that right now.
Is this primarily a theoretical threat at the moment, that people are worried about facial recognition being misused?
We've already seen at least one example of face recognition technology being used to arrest the wrong person. Abi, you want to talk a little bit about that case?
Yeah, you're referring to out of Michigan, Robert Williams case. And yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that I think paints a potential future that is quite bleak. It's a case where basically is a black man in Detroit arrested because the computer basically got it wrong, right? Like it was a facial recognition algorithm. The cops, basically the next day, the quote from the cops, the ACLU is suing the police there on behalf of Robert. And the quote from the cops the next day is, "The computer must have got it wrong." And, I think one, it's telling that he's from Detroit and is black. And right, the story basically is the computer got it wrong. The police did absolutely no police work to verify anything. They just went up and arrested him because the computer spit out his name. And in some sense, like if we don't fight these things, if we don't change these things, this is the kind of future we're living in, where yes, we already have cases where people are put in prison or falsely accused for all kinds of reasons, eyewitness testimony, DNA, whatever, right? But what's truly bleak is the concept of like the police now just are like getting a name from a computer and arresting someone. And that's the beginning and end of it.
The fact that we do this with other things really, it shouldn't be an excuse for just doing more of it, which is, what some of the argument I hear so far is, well, humans misidentify people. And I'm like, well, yeah, but the answer to that is to make the police do more work than that, not to just have another way that police don't have to do the full work. And this story is especially scary because they showed up and they handcuffed him in front of his two little daughters who are 2 and 5 years old. And his wife had to go to his work and say, look, please don't fire him. He's been wrongly arrested, and now his DNA and all the other stuff are going to go into the databases, right? I mean, some of this is also the machinery once you get arrested is really, really damaging to people in the long run. And so we need to be a lot more careful on the front end, not less.
And I think it also points to people's treatment of new technology too, in the idea that a computer can be faultless and therefore you can just obey what it suggests is something that I don't think that technologists and I include myself, all of us, do enough to disabuse people of, right? That these systems aren't perfect in the way that you would want them to be perfect. They're very good in certain directions, but those directions don't necessarily, point in the way of justice.
Someone like Trump can come along and say Antifa, which is just kind of a loose concept, but its looseness is exactly its purpose, right? Because it allows law enforcement, or it allows a section within law enforcement to enact a political agenda, right? And it's a moment like our law has built up that capacity through terrorism and gang laws, primarily aimed at minority communities, to the point that now they can, with Antifa, it can be done to a political community that is no longer minority racially, right? So that's a capacity that has been built, and it's only augmented by the technical capacity of creating those networks and spitting out a list.
Yeah, and so much surveillance works like this, right? You create an other. The bad guy, it was after 9/11, it was Muslims. It's no surprise to me that Black Lives Matter activists have been suggested as being on the terrorism watch list for a long time. And now, of course, you're right, it's Antifa, which is even less of a thing in terms of a cohesive movement. But, you create this category of people who can be subject to intense surveillance, intense tracking, intense watching. And then, of course, the political pressures, the political influences are going to start using that category for whoever they don't like, or to shore up their base, by creating a hated other. So, surveillance is just one of the tools that gets used in one of these systems where, we stop thinking of everyone as having equal rights, but we start creating classes of people who, by virtue of being a member of something or alleged member of something, just don't have rights. And I think you're totally right that this grows out of the way that law enforcement has achieved the ability to treat gangs as if they're not, citizens.
And what I think ties this together is that what we're seeing is a process of law that isn't about what you've done, but about who you are and who you associate with. And that's an error. It's an obvious error in justice and due process, but it's the sort of error that can be really exploited if you're selling facial recognition systems and algorithms, because those algorithms are designed to say, here is a cluster of people, and here is the evidence that connects them together. And we shouldn't be basing judicial decisions on the clustering nature of people, because there's a right of association, and the clustering algorithms of systems that aren't designed to deal with the subtleties of mapping out those systems.
This really reminds me of the work that we've done around Cisco and the Great Firewall in China, right? Because, Cisco sold a specific module to at least the allegations are, well, that's not even allegations. We have evidence that Cisco
have PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, we have PowerPoint slides that show that Cisco sold a module to the Chinese government that, they touted as being like really great at being able to identify who's a member of the Falun Gong based on who they talk to, where they go, and what they're looking at online, because of course the Great Firewall watches all of these things. And essentially, what adding face recognition into the government's arsenal here does is it helps make that kind of a system much more powerful and much more ready to be deployed against people who are engaging in political protests, just like it could be deployed against identifying, in the context of China, a religious group. So it's very dangerous.
Well, yeah, and conversely, right, if it's working, it identifies them. And even if it's not working, it chills them.
Yeah, and that gets to the whole other set of things that we don't have time to talk about. But, what does transparency look like? What does accountability look like in these systems? We'd like to ban face recognition. But as you mentioned before we even got on this call, Abi, face recognition is just one of a suite of tools that law enforcement now has at their disposal that is pretty dangerous. And making sure that we can have access to those tools, that we can unleash our techs to figure out how it actually works and what is it looking at and what was it trained on, and all of those kinds of things are an essential part of how we need to think about law enforcement technologies before they get adopted, not trying to paste it on afterwards.
I mean, how do we fix this? Like, what is, it's the easiest question to give, but what is the way forward here? Because I think what you've described is a long-term problem that's embedded in the very direction that law and law enforcement has been unfortunately stumbling towards for decades, augmented by a technology that is rapidly improving. How do we navigate this? What would be on your list of things that you would want to achieve to stop such bad consequences from expanding?
We have to keep doing what we're doing at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, at the international level. We have to keep fighting things as they come up. We have to maybe hold things at bay while we can. But, in some sense, I worry that that's not enough, right? That because it's not just facial recognition; it's institutions, it's the structure of society in a lot of ways, and facial recognition is just another tool in that existing structure, right? And so, I think that we need to fight the fights that we have now, so as to be able to fight the bigger fights later.
So this is a question of sort of holding things back. And this is the benefit of putting in transparency, putting in actual bans of facial recognition. This is to sort of hold this anti-democratic technology at bay so we can fix the bigger problems that allow it to be used.
Yeah, we need to be able to build ourselves space to build, right? I think that's so much of the dynamic is just fighting the repression that keeps us from being able to figure out how to get out of it, right? So I do think we should, I think we should ban a lot of things that a lot of the law enforcement tactics and tools and ideologies need to be, we can't just ban them because they're institutions, but if they're asking for a new toy, we can try to ban that before it becomes integrated completely into the institution.
Thinking about what can be done, not so just on a personal level, but as part of a community of technologists. So much of this technological adoption is far away from any kind of evidence-based adoption, right? That it is literally sold on the glossy brochures and snake oil of surveillance manufacturers. We have someone on EFF staff who goes to these conferences where these are sold and comes back with catalogs, which is half spooky and scary for us to look through, and half us just going, they're just lying, right? It can't do what they're saying it could do. So I think that one of the useful tasks that technologists can take on this is calling out the bullshit when they see it. And you can do that in your own community, right? You can do that in your own neighborhood, because often surveillance is sold as a good. Like, it's not hidden. It's like Ring. It's sold to a community as something that will improve their safety. And when it's out in the open like that, I think that there's some real benefits in challenging its capabilities and showing that its results aren't what people would ever want.
That's, I'm so glad you said that, because I think that that's a really key kind of at the social level point, right? Like that if we think about the history of so you guys are probably familiar with, I think it was the 2009 NIST report on forensic science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where looking at these things like bite mark evidence, like burn pattern experts, it's full on phrenology for law enforcement, right? And engaging, I recently, COVID canceled it, but I was going to do a panel a few months ago with a biologist, right? And trying to build a connection between, because this is someone who actually knows how DNA works, and actually knows population genetics, and, bringing some of those kind of cross currents to we aren't engaging the real scientific community enough, I don't think. And, maybe they're not engaging us enough as well. But building and that's part of what I was saying before about this delegitimizing. We have to delegitimize bad science. We can't give that up. But to do that, we kind of need to engage with the real scientists, right? Like we need to engage with the technologists who know what they're talking about and have an inkling towards this kind of understanding to like show why these things are illegitimate or why they're not doing what they're saying they're doing or why it's, I think that that's kind of something I'm very interested in figuring out how to build some of those bridges, right? Because these investigatory projects of law enforcement, they're not actually investigations in that scientific sense, right? They are like largely just a way of justifying something that you've already decided. They're quite the opposite. But as a defense lawyer, I can say that, but it doesn't have the weight that a scientist might have, for example.
Right.
Let's also talk a little more about what it would look like if we got it right. What I'm hearing is, you're unhappy with the decision the government makes, you can go out and protest, and that doesn't go into your permanent record. What other things do you think about? Let's assume a world in which we get all of this right. What does it look like for somebody like you or somebody who you're advising, Abi?
Well, that's a very hard question, but in the realm of protest, right? I would want to see a world where people are much freer to organize together, to build new institutions without fear, to create new ways of working together. And, that, like, as we talked about before, this kind of freedom of association, I would like to see that be real, right? Like, I would like to see that be real beyond even just marching in a street, but real in a way where we are organizing in the world to make our lives actually materially better, right? And that, like, just because that might be, we're using political mechanisms, we're using legal mechanisms, we're using protest mechanisms, we're doing all kinds of things. Because I don't want to say like, oh, we're just going to solve all the problems. There's no end state to history, right? Like we're engaging, but like, I don't think that the police should have a place in that. I don't think that policing as we know it is a thing that we should have, frankly. But like, it especially shouldn't be the like institution that stops people from making their lives better.
I wonder, what would it be like if when we went out to go protest, we had, a social service agency, right? The Protest Protection Society that came out and made sure that the kinds of, things like putting up the barriers and making sure that traffic gets redirected, maybe those things, and making sure that if somebody is misbehaving, they're ejected. We had something more like bouncers and social service people who attend the protest rather than people who are engaged in trying to stop and create accountability for crime, because protesting isn't criminal.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying, we could get to the criminal part later because that's a whole other thing, or maybe we don't have time, right? But in some sense, like I don't want to be protesting. Like I want to be organizing, right? I want to be building something.
I love it. Your future's even better than mine. Go on.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is like 100 years ago, the so-called protests were sit-down strikes, right? Shutting down the economy to like end the robber barons from like paying you a penny and you're living on a company town or whatever, right? So like, our country has a pretty often forgotten or not even taught, pretty brutal labor history. And that wasn't protesting, right? That was organizing. That was like saying that like, it's not right. And we're going to take what's ours. Like we're going to build an institution to have power to make our lives better. And like the police and the Pinkertons and what have you were the pioneers of today's surveillance technology, right? That's who the Pinkertons literally created the first database, which was like the Rogues Gallery, like the first kind of facial recognition system. And it was used primarily, or at least largely, to fight union organizing, right? I guess what I want to say is like, what I want to see is we need to, one, fight these things so that we can have even the groundwork necessary to like build something better. Because right now they're nipping it in the bud, right? So, that's as close to like, I don't want to paint a utopia because I don't know if that exists, but I do want to say that like, we need to be able to change things and build new things. And like, if we keep going on this path, they're not going to let us build anything.
I really love this because I think it puts the kind of street protests we're seeing kind of in their place, which is, one of the few remaining tools of a society that is kind of desperately headed off the rails, but also shutting down all the ways in which people can make it better short of that. Like by the time you're protesting in the street, things have gone terribly, terribly wrong. And what I hear you saying is like, let's get to a future where we don't even have to get to that place because we've actually set the balance right at a much higher level with real ability to organize and make change that doesn't require us to get to that place where we have to take to the streets.
I often find bans to be a clumsy way of dealing with technological development, partly because it's not always clear what you should be banning ahead of time, and that there were ways of implementing the same thing that evade the ban, but also because that technology is always going to be around. Do you see, in these futures, what do you see the role of technologies like facial recognition being? And how do you think they should be controlled in a democratic society?
Well, I mean, I guess honestly, I feel like you've answered your question just with the question, because you said what we need is a democratic society, right? Like what we need, I mean, I don't have a better answer than like democracy, right? Like having an actual say in how our society is constructed, right? I mean, part of the reason we're protesting on the street is because we don't have a say in actually changing things. Like we're told, oh, go and vote every 4 years. Sure, we should do that. But that's not enough, right? And so I think that there's a lot of frustration and people are saying, hey, things are getting worse. And I just don't, what can I even do but just yell in the street? And so, what we need is democracy. What we need is strong institutions that are democratically controlled by the people who are part of them that have power. And right now, so when we're talking about the use of these technologies, when we're talking about anything that like I guess the simplest way to say it is like we need to reestablish or establish a commons that is like the space of the people online or the space of the people in the world as it relates to digital technology. And that needs to be ours. And we need to have control of it, right? Like it shouldn't be just that that Amazon and the cops control how we live in public space, right? We should have control of that. And so yeah, the answer I would say is yes, democracy.
I think of transparency, making sure that law enforcement has to tell us when they're looking at this, that we have a voice to say and whether they get to say it, and we get to see what's really going on. Transparency reports after the fact are not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about pre-purchase transparency, and that has to involve both law enforcement and the companies who are providing the information. And then, community control and input at every level. And then having accountability in the courts. So when things go wrong and when the upfront transparency and control aren't working, you have the after the fact ability to create accountability and set things right. And, I think of things like private rights of action and strengthening the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment right to be able to declare something has been improper or throw out evidence. So I'm all strategies, right? So I think of those as the kinds of things we're doing that are going to try to set the table so that we can have democratic control.
Abi, thank you very much. It's great talking to you.
Yeah, thanks. This has been great fun.
Yeah, it's been really fun. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was one of those conversations that I didn't want to end because there was so much to unpack. I think one of the things that immediately stuck out for me as a bit of a, internet utopian optimist is this very dystopian idea of face recognition as almost the opposite of what we want from technology. I always saw the internet as a way to help organize people and create new institutions and ways of cooperating together. And Abi makes this point that facial recognition is this anti-organization technology. It actually dissuades people from collectively acting.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I also liked how he ties the whole thing together with the broader movement for social justice and brings in his labor background, and really is talking about protests, not as because we care about protests, but because we care about the bigger work of trying to make society better. So, he really forced us to broaden the conversation from just the narrow topic of face surveillance at protests to the bigger, why we care about this.
Yeah, and I think Abby pulled me out of the sort of short-sighted way I view facial recognition as being particularly pertinent to protest, because he made this point that protest itself is kind of a democratic failure mode, that no one, immediately thinks of protest as the first step that they should take and going out in the streets. It's only when other ways of speaking out or being able to change your environment have failed do you go into this. So if we're going to think about civil liberties more broadly and digital civil liberties, we have to think about what they're doing to everything else.
Yeah. The other thing I really like about Abi is that, he comes at this as a criminal defense lawyer. And then, Danny, you made this really great point that, ultimately, if you're thinking about associations and assembly, it's really these prosecutions are about who you are and who you know rather than, what you did. And that's particularly dangerous. And it reminds me of, why we care about metadata, right? And some of the fights that we have against not the, the local cops as much as the national security agency, but also local cops as well. That's what metadata does. It may not give the content of what you're doing, but it says who you are, who you're talking to, and who you associate and assemble with.
Right. And it lets police or the intelligence services construct this case from that association, when association should never be a crime in itself, right? The other thing Abby reminded me about was when he talked about evidence-based reform, right? And the need for a coalition of academics and computer scientists who can speak out about when these sort of facial recognition systems are just snake oil, what their failings are. And that really reminded me of the successful coalition we had on the war on encryption in the 90s and early 2000s, where trying to break encryption was presented in this same way. And also the danger of all our communications being encrypted was played up as this huge threat. And what we were able to do collectively is bring in the computer scientists and the academics to highlight where the hype was and what was actually practical and what could actually achieve change. And the more I think about it, the more I think about how powerful that is in all kinds of police reform, right? That ultimately, I think when people are talking about changing the police or moving away from policing, what they want is something that's more effective in achieving what people want from law and order. And I can well believe that if we really started applying that reasonably to this new digital space, the institution could become, unrecognizable from what we have now.
Yeah, I think that we have a lot of police work that really we see the police really doing the same things over and over and over again without the kind of intervention of, is this actually working? Is it serving the community or is it not serving the community? And what would serve the community better? Because, nobody's arguing for an unsafe community, but I think there's a lot that could be gained from applying the same kind of scientific study to police tactics that I think you're right, that we tried to bring so much to the encryption debate. I think there are reasons to be hopeful about this. I think that we have pretty quickly been able to convince a wide swath of Americans that face recognition in the hands of police during protests is really a problem. I think we're helped a lot by that because it's pretty creepy and it's a pretty easy lift. But we're already seeing places across the country beginning to do bans on it and buying us the kind of time that Abi talked about to be able to sort out, what we want to do and bring in all the other kinds of fixes that we talked about, like transparency and community control and these kinds of things. So, it would have been better if we could have gotten in on the ground floor before police departments had this technology. But, as we know from the horrible story out of Detroit, that the police are already using some of this kind of stuff. But it's not as late as it's been with some other technologies. And so there's room for us to begin to really fix this.
It's always going to be difficult to stop an attractive piece of technology like this from falling into the hands of law enforcement. But we've made a good start, and with folks like Abi fighting for this, I think there's a real chance that we can fix this. Well, thanks for listening, and see you next time. Thanks again for joining us. If you'd like to support the Electronic Frontier Foundation, here are 3 things you can do today. 1, you can hit subscribe in your podcast player of choice. And if you have time, please leave a review. It helps more people find us. 2, please share on social media and with your friends and family. 3, please visit EFF.org/podcasts, where you will find more episodes, learn about these issues. You can donate to become a member, and lots more. Members are the only reason we can do this work. Plus, you can get cool stuff like an EFF hat or an EFF hoodie, or even a camera cover for your laptop. Thanks once again for joining us. If you have any feedback on this episode, please email podcast@EFF.org. We do read every email. This podcast was produced by the Electronic Frontier Foundation with the help from Stuka Studios. Music by Nat Keefe of Beatmower.